Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Current. I'm joined with Curtis. Another Friday episode. We're excited you're here. Let's talk just a second, real quick, because I was just in the office yesterday, and I hopped on one of the Bird scooters that's parked outside of our door.
Okay.
Took it for a spin.
Right.
That's pretty pricey. It's 39 cents a minute.
Does it also do it by the mile?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So I had to pay $5, and it got me like, I don't know how many minutes that is.
Was it good, though?
Actually, it might be 30. I don't know. I played $5 and I got ready for like 7 minutes. So I thought it was
That
39
does seem a
cents
little
minute.
steep.
But yeah, I don't know. It was like, I just rode around the block a few times. I tried to get Pam to ride it, our office.
No
She would not do it.
Oh, I would.
It's actually pretty cool, though. It actually goes pretty fast.
They're good. They have some zip to them. So in Chicago, they had these scooters placed all over the city. There was a bunch of different like brands of them too, but Bird was one of them, and I used that one, and I thought it was awesome. It's nice they get around quick. I could see, I don't know in Mason City quite as much, but I feel like they're getting used. I see people on them all the time.
Yeah, we were driving home last night and I saw people on them.
It could be the new thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out like the most, like what's their target audience? Like, is it people without vehicles? Because I mean, honestly, at the end of my ride on my phone, it told me how much emissions, like environmentally helpful it was that I rode the scooter.
That you did that instead of a car.
Yeah, but I wonder if they're trying to replace vehicles. If that's really their hope with those.
It might be tough in this town, but
Yeah,
they can
but
try.
like I wonder, like Mason City, it's probably just for fun.
I think we should get a whole church scooter gang together, meet up, just scooter across the town.
There is an option on there to group ride.
No way.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't know how it works.
All right,
but
look out. We're coming. That'd be awesome.
It was fun, though. Pam got a video. She thought it was really funny.
Cool. So we should look out for
I
that
don't know
on
why she thought it
Facebook.
was funny. I was being dead serious. Like, I really wanted to try it, and she thought it was hilarious. I'm like, this is not funny.
It would be funny if she got on it. I'd love to see her ride it.
She said she really wants to, but she was too scared yesterday.
We'll make it happen.
I hope so. So, yeah, shout out to Bird. We're going to tag them. And
Oh, yeah.
we got to.
Not an official sponsor yet, but we're working on it.
Yeah, it was fun. Well, let's jump into the episode today. We're going to be talking about kind of a new little mini-series here on how to read the Bible.
Yeah.
And today we're going to do the Old Testament, how to read the Old Testament, and then next Friday we'll talk about how to read the New Testament.
Yeah, I think this would be super good. I know, especially, maybe this was your experience too, but as kind of a young Christian, first handed the Bible a little bit, I really did feel like they were like, hey, here's this book, it's important, you should read it, and like God's talking to you in it, but that was about all I got. And so I was sort of left to my own devices to stumble my way through this book and slowly make some more sense of it because, I don't know, if I'm being honest, the Bible is not like super clear and easy to read.
No.
Some things are come across very clear.
Yeah.
Jesus is called to love our neighbor as ourselves. We get that. We can do it. But then somehow you find yourself in Leviticus and they're like talking about not boiling goats in their mother's milk and like don't mix fabrics. And I'm thinking, what am I doing here? What's going on? So
Yeah.
I think this will be a really helpful series just to give some good tips. And especially I like that we're breaking it up Old Testament and New Testament because we are dealing with slightly different things when we're crossing that divide.
Yeah, and I know for sure, like me growing up, I was obviously raised in church, but same thing. It was mainly, the emphasis was on like, you should be praying before you read it, and pray after you read it, and the Holy Spirit will always communicate some truth to you.
Yeah.
Reading the Bible, and boy, oh boy, so many times
quite
I would
work out like
pray and read and
What's going on? God just must not want to talk to me
I
today.
just think, man, I must be doing something wrong. But a lot of times I didn't even know, like we're going to talk a lot about today, context and like,
Yeah.
I wish they would spend more time teaching how to read the Bible than just emphasizing the importance of reading it.
The need to. Yeah, I think that's so good. And I think God meets us where we're at in a lot of ways. And I have had some moments where I'm reading through and it's like a verse jumps off the page and it feels like there's something profound. But more often than not, and you're right, I just kind of read it and I'm like, okay, what do I do with this? What's going on?
Yeah.
So, I think we have some helpful tips lined up, some good stuff.
Sure.
And we're starting off talking Old Testament, which is its own separate beast.
Yep. And I think this is a good episode for those of you that, I don't know, maybe we'll take notes or jot some things down. We have some bullet points here that I feel like would be really helpful to a listener if you want to just, I don't know. I think it's like a kind of a checklist, essentially. Like it's kind of, as you're reading, if you kept these things in mind,
Yes.
I feel like it would really be helpful for you as you read through the Bible. So yeah, Old Testament, obviously, we can talk a little bit just about why they're divided up, if we want. Like we talk about kind of the, I don't know, like why there's two portions, and then we'll jump into kind of how to read the Old Testament.
That's good. Yeah, we have a little bit of a do and don't list for you.
Yeah.
A good place to start is just kind of what is the Old Testament, New Testament, why are they different? And that's a good question. So, really, the word that we translate as testament really would be better translated as covenant.
Yeah.
We're talking about Old Covenant and New Covenant. And so we're really kind of talking about the divide before and after Jesus, essentially, is what's going on. So everything you have in the Old Testament sort of encompasses Israel's history and God's working under the Old Covenant.
Yep.
So we move our way all the way up through Israel gets taken into exile, and they're out, and then they're trying to kind of rebuild and put things back together. Then you have a gap of time that happens in between, and that's actually where we get the Apocrypha, which some Christians will read. There's some time in between that. And then Jesus steps up on the scene, bursts this new covenant, and so then we have the New Testament, which is everything that takes place or is recording after that sort of span of Jesus. So you could really just say pre-Jesus, post-Jesus maybe is a good way to do it.
And this will kind of tie into our first point here, but we cannot forget that the Bible is composed of 66 different books.
Yes.
That makes up the Bible.
Yeah.
And that leads us to our first point, is that it's all not the same genre.
Exactly.
So if you're taking notes, don't forget genre. And this is especially important in the Old Testament.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of readers sit down and read the Old Testament and they assume that it's all like a textbook. It's just facts, and I'm reading a textbook, and really that's not the genre of the Old Testament. And there's different genres within the Old Testament, but it's so important.
Exactly. I love that you start with saying, hey, understand that we have 66 distinct books here. And that's important. Some people, I think the Bible dropped out of the sky completely leather-bound as it is. That's not how it worked. We went through a long process to compile all these 66 books. So really, when we're holding the Bible, we're not holding a book as much as we're holding a library.
That's right.
And we're getting to see all these different books within them. And you're right. These different books are going to have different goals, trying to communicate different points, and they're going to do so utilizing different genres. So like the easiest way we can point this out is, I think of like the book of Psalms is a great example.
Yeah.
Here we are reading poetry and songs and stuff. So when we're reading some of these things, we shouldn't be taking it as like literal or trying to communicate something historical oftentimes. It's like, no, they're just making this kind of poetic point. So we're going to want to read that a lot differently than, say, we read Kings or Chronicles that is trying to give us this narrative of what's going on in Israel's history, and they got good kings and bad kings. So it shakes out different, and we need to read them according to their genre. And probably the most controversial of this would be probably like a book like Genesis. Yep. There's a lot of debate amidst biblical scholars and theologians about what is the genre. Is this communicating history? Is it communicating history using the genre of myth? Is it total fiction? You have all sorts of perspectives and everywhere in between, but we need to agree that, when we're reading these books, we need to understand, what's the author intending to communicate, and how are they intending to communicate it? Yeah,
I think how this was explained to me that I've always just kind of clung to, and I think a great example that a lot of our listeners will be able to relate to is, found in the Old Testament, the story of Jonah and the whale, or the big fish.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a great example. You have to think to yourself, could Jonah have been swallowed by a big fish in the ocean and lived inside somehow in its belly without drowning?
Yep. 3 days.
For 3 days. Is it possible? Sure. I guess it's possible. Like, God could work that to happen.
Preserve him, or
I'm assuming. Or is something else going on here?
Yeah.
Like, do I have to read it as literal fact? Again, like, this is I'm reading a textbook, like this happened in history. Again, could it have happened? Sure. But is there a bigger picture? Is there a bigger story? Is there something else that's trying to be communicated by the story of Jonah and the whale, or Jonah and the fish? So that's just one example. And again, people, will fight about this, and maybe call me a heretic if I don't think Jonah and the whale happened. But again, not that it's, what was the phrase used earlier? Just because it's maybe not historically true doesn't mean it's not theologically true.
Yeah.
And I think that is really important to remember when reading the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think, sometimes what happens is we do feel the need to say, like, yeah, unless everything in these stories happened historically exactly as they've been presented to us, the whole Bible fails. And I think we kind of set it up where the stakes are a bit too high. And we don't need to. Because here's, if I'm just being honest where I sit, the historicity of Jonah, like, I'm kind of fine to take it or leave it. I don't feel the stakes are so high that I need to. Like, if this didn't happen historically, everything out of the Bible is thrown out. I can say, no, what is this author trying to communicate about God, about us, about Israel's story through the Jonah story? And even if that didn't take place historically, that's still true for us. It still has something to teach us. God's still looking to communicate something. On the other hand, far be it for me to say that God couldn't keep Jonah alive in the belly of a whale for 3 days. Sure.
Yeah.
But either way, I'm okay. I can navigate forward. I understand this text is trying to teach and communicate something to me. So when we set the stakes so high, I think we just risk a bit more than we need to. And then sometimes we make the Bible too big to fail. And it's like, nope, it's got to be true. It's got to all like put blinders on to any other evidence, and I'll make sure, and we just can't. We can't cede any historical ground or the whole thing collapses. So keeping genre in mind, understanding that, yeah, we're not just reading a bunch of history books, I think can give us some freedom and let us take a deep breath too, not always have to be worried.
Yeah, and again, like the main point of this part of our podcast episode today is remember genre. It's so important, especially in the Old Testament. There's so many different ones, and again, just to assume it's all the same, it all has the same purpose, it's all the same writing, it's just doing you a massive disservice.
Yeah. And I think, genre is another great thing when, like you say, I talked at the beginning of the episode, you get to Leviticus, and it's talking about boiling goats and milk, and you're like, what is going on?
Yeah.
But hey, like, I'm understanding, I'm reading a certain piece of literature, I'm getting a genre that is sort of this law or law giving, and so I'm going to read it and understand it in that light, but I'm not going to say, and this is going to get to kind of our next point, oh, this is what's kind of going on at all times in all places.
Yeah.
We have to do a bit more than just remember the genre. And I think the second thing that we get to is to say, hey, not only don't forget genre, but don't forget it's not about you.
That's right.
Now, this sounds kind of strange.
Yeah.
People are going to read like, the Bible's not about me? What am I? And I try to remember, or I try to remind people that when we pick up the Bible, when we read it, we're really reading someone else's mail. These letters were not addressed to us. Nothing was put for 21st century American church. That's not it. We have letters and stories that are talking about people in different places facing different struggles in different contexts, and they're communicating about those things. Very rare is it for us to find, especially in the Old Testament, I think a verse that directly applies or speaks to us. Yeah. We have to do a lot of translating, and so we got to remember where we're at. It's not necessarily about us.
Yeah, and I will give people a break here. I feel like the church has done a very poor job of portraying this idea that when you pick up the Bible, you should find you in it. And they'll say things like that, or like, what is God trying to say to you here?
The Bible's God's love letter to us.
Yeah, and like I feel like the church has failed people in this a lot of ways. So a lot of people, again, if that may be a new concept to you, it's probably not your fault. I feel like maybe your church has, given you this idea that it's all about you, and you find yourself in the scriptures and all this stuff. Like we've done all these kind of phrases, and again, I was taught myself the Bible is like, what's God saying to you? Like,
exactly.
And really, he's not saying anything to me. He's saying something to, first century Jews that, might somehow apply to me today somehow, but it's not to me.
Right. And I think that's a great point to say, like, hey, the Bible might not be to us, but I want to say it's for us in some sense.
For sure.
We're learning from these stories. We're understanding the working of God throughout the Israel story and throughout the Jesus story, and that has implications for me, how I live my life, how I see the world. But that's not because I opened up Isaiah and thought the prophet Isaiah was speaking to me about something going on in my life. He just isn't, It's just not how it works.
Yeah. And a great example of this is kind of speaking of the Old Testament, kind of some verses you see all the time, like Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you. People take that one verse and apply it to themselves about graduation or like going through tough times. And like, while yes, like I think God's heart is that he wants what's best for you and he does want, that verse again in context and what it makes sense has nothing to do with you overcoming challenges or really anything about that.
Israel struggling with being in exile and saying, God, where you at? What's going on? You know, it's just a very different thing.
It's about his covenant with his people. And Yeah. So, but I mean, it just happens all the time. You know, we take one verse and like, oh, this is me. This is my life, and you just can't do that and remain, you know, being faithful to the text.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we sometimes naturally do this as readers, which is interesting. Like when I catch people reading spots in the Old Testament where it talks about not wearing mixed fabrics, or it talks about not eating pork or things that have hooves, most people instinctively say like, oh, that doesn't apply to me. This isn't for me. And so we get the sense that like not everything in this book is being communicated about me in my life and I need to obey directly. And I think the struggle comes where we're trying to understand where that line is and where it isn't. We get it with some things, but I think we need to do better at applying it to the whole of the Old Testament, not just the very weird laws we don't want to deal with.
Preach.
That'll preach.
That'll preach.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the Old Testament is we've mentioned this before. Not only is it just very difficult to read in certain parts, you know, but there is some major inconsistencies with exactly what you just said about people taking certain parts and applying it to them, but then other parts don't apply. And so what we're trying to do is just create a framework that is more consistent across the text as a whole, because we don't want to have churches also get caught up in this too. Again, it's not necessarily maybe people's fault, but kind of how they've been taught and conditioned. Is that some things apply, some don't.
Right.
You know, like you start playing this game of, well, you know, you have to start making conditions on the text and like things like that. Whereas we just have a broader understanding of, hey, this was written for, you know, to tell a story. It was, you know, and I think a lot of people forget too is for the majority of the Old Testament was probably given orally, you know, through like or like grandparents to their kids, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it was probably passed on for a long time just through the spoken word.
Yes,
you know,
which, lot
again,
of this
people
stuff.
forget about.
Yeah.
It's not just like it plopped down, like, you know, like a lot of this stuff you're talking about the creation of the world. It had to have, you know, again, if this is something that passed through time, they didn't have a printing press. You know, they didn't have the ability to write. I mean, most of these stories were probably told you know, by an orator for years and years and years before it was ever written or made
put down. Definitely all of these books to some degree existed as like some form of oral tradition originally, being able to talk, and they were a very oral society and culture. That's how you retained and gave information, and that's an important thing to remember too. And I think, you know, we see this, you know, even we look through Genesis and that stuff, you talk about being there for the creation of the world and that stuff. Yeah, it's not like someone had a video recorder and then like wrote it all down and then was like, here's what happened. And I don't think it's like, hey, God zapped the writer of Genesis into a trance and like made him pen certain things. I don't think that's how it works. I think instead we do have a culture who's coming to grapple with this question of where are we from? How does this world find its origins? What's behind this world? Is it good? Is it bad? And Israel borrows a lot of the language and some of the framework of the surrounding cultures. Like, you know, there's a Babylonian creation myth called the Illumination, and it's very strikingly similar to the one we have in Genesis, but it diverges at some key important parts. We see God as the one creator God who makes and sustains and creates order out of the chaos that's going on. We see just a different picture. So while it borrows some of the same backdrop from surrounding cultures, it gives it a very Jewish spin, helps it see it in light of this Yahweh creator God. So again, reading it and understanding, okay, I get it. These are certain people writing to an audience at that time. Yeah, it wasn't a, you know, video camera just rolling of the creation of the world.
Yeah. So good. And I want to just kind of jump into our last point here. And this one's going to be a little tricky, so we'll have to spend some time kind of explaining this because there's a lot of kind of nuance in this particular point. But so let's recap real quick. So don't forget genre. Don't forget it's not about you. The last thing we would say is don't forget the big picture. And here's what we mean by that. Don't forget the big picture. A lot of times when you read the Old Testament, it can be disheartening.
Sure,
It really can. It can be disturbing.
Yes.
It can be confusing. I remember like kind of going through this not that long ago, just reconciling some violence.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
That you read about in the Old Testament.
Absolutely.
Things like that. I mean, the Old Testament is difficult. It's challenging in a lot of ways, but we cannot forget the big picture. Now, again, we're going to spend some time talking about what this means, but I'm also not going to skip this. I want to be clear up front in saying that, yes, there are some things in the Old Testament that are horrific,
Yeah.
that are awful, that make God seem like a monster. Yes, absolutely true. So I'm not shying away from that. There are things you read in the Old Testament that probably disturb you and cause you some serious questions. And so that's what we want to do by this point, by just giving some clarity to that, to understanding maybe a better way to view the Old Testament, and again, how to read it in a way that's faithful to the entire collection of scriptures, not just one piece. So
yes,
don't forget the big picture.
Absolutely. And I think this point actually kind of helps us with the second point. Like we said, hey, you know, there's some things that apply to us and things that don't, and how can we have a consistent framework that helps us navigate that? And I think this point is what gives us the ability to do that. It's once we zoom out, we understand the big picture, that it helps us go back into those small parts of the picture and say, okay, how do I relate to this? What's going on? Another great example of this is, again, we have to keep in the big picture of what's going on throughout the entire Bible story. And so, sure, we get to Leviticus and we're seeing God giving laws for his people not to eat this or that. Now, if we were to just read Leviticus and that's all we had, we'd think, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. But we get to the New Testament, we get to Jesus, and we hear in Mark's gospel, let's say, where Jesus says it's not what goes into your body that defiles you, but that what comes out. And then Mark gives this parenthetical statement, and he says, thus Jesus made all foods clean. Right? People reading the New Testament story, we keep the big picture. We say, oh, something happened that makes this not the norm or a bit more obsolete. Let me give one more example that I think might be a little bit more poignant. No one's kind of worried about, okay, I know I shouldn't eat whatever foods. I think it's interesting when we get to a case study like we look in the Old Testament and we see God sometimes approving of, if not sanctioning, polygamy. And we say, whoa, what's going on? I thought Christians were all about marriages and monogamy. And I'd want to say absolutely. But we have to understand the big picture. God's at work in a particular community. He's accommodating. He's meeting them where they're at. It's not the ideal. He's kind of working within their structures to pull them towards the ideal. And so, yeah, I look at this and I say, David got himself a lot of wives. That's interesting. But when I take the big picture into account, I say, okay, the ideal, the aim, the intent is not polygamy. It's rather monogamy. So if we're just trying to be proof texters and read the Bible and say the Old Testament says whatever, we can come up with a lot of crazy stuff. So we have to keep that big picture in mind, I think, to help check and navigate our reading of the Old Testament.
Yeah. And another, I think, great example, again, I mentioned this just briefly a minute ago about, for me, it came down to like reconciling violence. And, you read the Old Testament and God supposedly is commanding genocide or calling specific leaders of armies to go kill a bunch of women and children. Things like that, or wiping out enemies, destroying enemies, and things like that. Well, you read that, and then you read the New Testament where Jesus comes along and he says to love your enemies.
Right.
Like, so how can the two coexist? Like, how do they? Someone's got to give here. And really, there's only a few options, I think. Either like the Old Testament writers got it wrong about God.
Yep.
Or they assumed God wanted them to do something that God didn't really want.
Yeah.
God's really a monster, or
commanded those things.
Like that's the type of God we serve. Like he doesn't really care, or God changed.
Right.
Or he's kind of changed his ways throughout history. Personally, I don't jive with a couple of those.
I can understand.
I don't want to really believe that God has changed throughout history.
Right.
I also don't believe that God's a monster. Is really just a sick and twisted being that accomplishes purposes by railroading and getting whatever he wants and killing anybody he wants. I honestly think that they assumed it's what God wanted, and it probably wasn't true.
Yeah.
And so when I read things like that, like I have to come to some type of like understanding, like at some level there's like a grasp for power. They're fighting enemies, they're and of course they want God on their side. And so they'll write things like, well, God commanded this, God wanted me to do this. And so it's hard to like wrestle with some of those things, but again, what I always come back to is the fact that we get to Jesus and he says to love your enemies, and that paints a picture of God that I think is it sits better with me. I guess it's much more beautiful. It's a God that I can handle. But Jesus himself even references the Old Testament sometimes. And he says, hey, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you something completely different. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. So Jesus himself is saying, like, hey, like, this is how it used to be. Old Testament, New Testament, New Covenant. We're doing things a little bit different. I have to remind myself of the big picture too. Because again, I read some of the Old Testament things. I'm like, oof, like what is going on here?
Yeah.
Like, does God really want that? And I would argue and say, no, he probably didn't. They just kind of stamp God's approval on some of the, honestly, the disgusting and awful things that they wanted to do, whether that be, again, power, control, advancement of their kingdoms or whatever it may be. So
well, I think we get in those narratives exactly what we would expect from an ancient Near Eastern culture who's going to battle and saying, hey, this is my deity on my side, and we won because we had this deity. And oftentimes they use a bit of hyperbole. They exaggerate. They make it bigger and more grandiose than it actually is. It's interesting. A lot of the archaeological evidence we have looking around some of these battles indicates that it's actually much smaller skirmishes than we see in the biblical narrative. Again, now, does that mean the Bible's false and we need to be... No, again, we're reading a particular genre. This is how people talked about battles and conquests in that time, and we need to keep that in mind. I love that you brought up Jesus's discussion of the Old Testament, though, because I think this is another great way to see how the big story changes what happened before. The Bible really is like a movie where there's like a twist ending, and you watch the movie, and then the twist happens. You're like, oh, crap, I did not see that coming. And then when you go back and you watch the movie, you see that first bit completely different than what you did. So Jesus is this twist ending that changes the story Israel wasn't ready for, and it also makes changes of some of the stuff we see early on. And some of the most interesting ways I think we see this is when we look at how writers of the New Testament or characters of the New Testament quote and use the Old Testament. So you bring up Jesus talking about an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Another really interesting thing Jesus does with the Old Testament is in Luke's gospel, early on in his ministry, he's grown. He goes into the synagogue and he essentially opens up the scroll of Isaiah, and it's this prophecy about the Messiah. And Jesus wants to say, hey, this is me. This is fulfilled. What's interesting is he quotes the passage in Isaiah. He says, I've come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to set captives free, to anoint whatever. Interestingly enough, Jesus ends up cutting off a verse at the very end and just stops quoting it mid-verse, like mid-sentence. This is not good Bible reading for some people. It's supposed to say, I've come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of our God's wrath, or day of our God's vengeance. Jesus gets right up to that and then just cuts the verse. Doesn't even quote the second part of it. And I'm sure the audience around it would have been a bit upset. Like, that's the juicy part. That's what they're waiting for. God's coming in to whoop our enemies' butts. But Jesus quotes this passage and decides to leave it off. Or another interesting example people can look at is how Paul uses the Old Testament. Dude does some interesting stuff. He'll take a passage that's originally about Gentiles being excluded, but then he'll take it and he'll kind of mess with the context a bit, and he'll employ this now as a passage for Gentile inclusion. Weird stuff, but Paul says, hey, look, some of this stuff that we see in the Old Testament is adjusted, it's changed, it's not the full picture, and we need to understand and interpret it differently. So I just think Jesus, Paul, all these people are realizing, hey, we're still in the midst of an ongoing narrative, and what we see in the Old Testament isn't where it's going to stay or what's necessarily ideal.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, a little recap.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. And again, hopefully you kind of took some notes, but don't forget genre. Don't forget it's not about you. And don't forget the big picture.
Yeah.
And really, I think if you take that into consideration as you read the Old Testament, and this would be a great episode to kind of just save and come back to.
Yeah.
Like if you're you want to start reading the Bible, you want to read the Old Testament. And I think, one common mistake I think a lot of people make when they pick up the Bible is just start in Genesis and start reading.
Yeah.
That is a very, very difficult thing to do.
It is.
So if you've done that and tried that and you get discouraged, like maybe start reading the Gospels. Like that would be a great place to start, and then maybe kind of work your way back and read through the Old Testament. There's some good Bible reading plans out there that kind of jump back and forth, which is good. But to pick the Bible up in Genesis and start reading is very, very tough. Again, there's a lot of cultural things. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a bigger picture that you have to kind of understand first before you just pick it up and start reading. So, if you have any other questions or you need some help kind of dissecting through some things, we'd love to be available. And real quick, I just want to make note before we wrap up here that we only have one more episode of video. So
That's
if you're a
right.
YouTube watcher, sorry, you'll have to kind of find another avenue to listen. But it's no big deal. Still on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can find a link on our website. A lot of ways you can listen. So
Absolutely.
don't be discouraged if you can't see our beautiful faces anymore. But yeah, it's going to be audio only after next week. So next week, last video episode. And then starting in September, it'll be audio only. So
Sounds great.
yeah, thanks for joining with us today. And join us next Friday as we continue the conversation on reading the New Testament. We'll see you then. Grace and peace.